Perhaps one of the most well-known stories that's been told for thousands of years at least is that of the flood myth. And if it's not familiar to you right now, we're going to do a brief synopsis here. And basically what happens is that mankind has become wicked in the eyes of God. And so God chooses a special person to build a boat, which is either known as a large ship or an ark, which I'll just represent here with this drawing and label it ark. And in this ark, the man who is chosen is saved from the flood waters, which rise and destroy the civilization of the wicked men, and leave the chosen man and his family and all the animals that he's saved in order to repopulate the earth once the flood waters go down. And perhaps perhaps the best known example of a flood myth is the story of Noah. And Noah appears to us in the story of Noah's Ark, and he appears in the book of Genesis in chapters 6 through 9, and he does exactly the story as we just described. He takes two of every species onto this giant ark that he builds by hand and rides out the floodwaters until, as the story goes, he lets a bird go one day and it brings him back an olive branch, showing that the waters have receded enough for trees to start growing again. But what most people don't realize is that Noah is just the best well-known story of flood myths that appear in cultures all around the world. And one of the most well-known of these secondary flood myths is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh was a Sumerian king who lived in or around the year 2700 BCE. And while Gilgamesh didn't ride out the flood himself, as told in the story The Epic of Gilgamesh, he goes to meet a man named Utnapishtim, who was the actual person who rode out the flood and repopulated the earth once the flood waters receded. And this story was actually written down sometime between the years 2000 and 1500 BCE, right around the time two other similar myths were being recorded. And one of those was the story of Atrahasis. And Atrahasis comes from the Babylonian culture, and this was recorded sometime in the 18th century BCE, right around the time that another story, similar story, was popping up, and that would be the story of Zusudra. And while not exactly the same, it's sort of similar about another giant flood, and this one was recorded in the 17th century BCE. And while all of these stories are not exactly the same, there are important differences between them, they're similar enough to make you think. If this kind of story appeared in different cultures throughout the world across this time of 1,000 years or so, could there be any truth to the fact that there was a large flood? And maybe it didn't destroy mankind, but one that was large enough to cause people to tell the story of a large flood for thousands and thousands of years until it was written down? It's a tantalizing possibility, and it's one that some archaeologists and hydrologists and scientists have actually taken seriously. And there's actually been a recent theory that we're going to talk about right now, which says that the story of the flood could actually have been involved with the filling of the Black Sea a couple of thousand years ago, and we're going to go over that theory right now. So before we jump into the flood myth, let's just get a feel for our geography of where we're going to be focusing. And the relevant part here is this body of water, the Sea of Marmara, in between the Aegean Sea on the left and the Black Sea on the right, and the two straits that go in and out of it. So the one on the west, which I'll circle here in red, is known as the Dardanelles, and I'll just label it Dardanelles. And the eastern one, where the city of Istanbul sits, that's known as the Bosphorus, and I'll label that in green. So we have the Dardanelles, which is the strait between the Aegean Sea and the Sea of Marmara, and the Bosphorus, which is the strait between the Sea of Marmara and the Black Sea. And just so we get our bearings, this here, which I'll label in yellow, is the Mediterranean Sea, and I'll just label it as ocean. And even though it's not technically the ocean, it is saltwater, which is important. And the Black Sea, which I'll just underline the name here in black, is a sea, so it is saltwater, and this is a huge inland sea that borders the countries you can see labeled here: Turkey, Georgia, Russia, Ukraine, Romania, and Bulgaria. So as the story goes, thousands and thousands of years ago, the Earth was in a much more severe ice age, and lots of ocean water was locked up in massive, massive glaciers, which spread down across Europe. And on the bottom right hand here, we can see this map of Europe, and I'll outline in pink where the glaciers were, or the southernmost extent of the glaciers, and it was pretty widespread. A lot of the major countries from Western and Eastern and Northern Europe today were completely covered by glaciers. And since the glaciers were so widespread, they sucked up a lot of the water from the ocean, so the ocean levels dropped. And this cut off the flow between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea, which I'll just label this blockage here in pink, right where Istanbul is today. And so that meant that the Black Sea was isolated, and since it was isolated, it began to shrink. And it shrunk down to a size kind of proportional to where its borders are today, but it was much, much smaller. And I'll outline that here in black and shaded in. So this was the extent of this inland Black Sea that existed. And this Black Sea, since it was isolated for such a long time, became freshwater, since it no longer had the saltwater input from the ocean. Now, a few thousand years later, once the glaciers began to recede, all that meltwater raised the levels of the ocean, some say by hundreds of feet. It's not known exactly, but it is definitely known that the oceans began to rise. And as the Mediterranean sea levels began to rise and water began to spill into the Aegean and the Sea of Marmara, it would press against the Bosphorus, and this dam that had developed separating the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara, according to this theory, burst one day in spectacular fashion, and thousands upon millions of gallons of water began rushing in from the ocean into the Black Sea, which I'll denote with these peach-colored arrows. So you can imagine that how much water had built up from the ocean is spilling into the Black Sea. And this theory says there was so much water, it was the equivalent of 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls every single day for 300 days, which is a huge amount of water. And it expanded the volume of the Black Sea. So what the part that I'll outline here in green. This is the part that was formerly land that now all of a sudden had salt water in it. And so since this was land bordering a Black Sea, as the theory goes, the people who were living in this area were farmers, and they suddenly had to move because the water was up to their ankles one day and up to their knees the next, and they had to move out of the way, otherwise they would drown. And as the theory goes, this is the basis for the flood myth. Since all these people experienced a huge inundation of water in a rapid period of time, they passed down this knowledge verbally for thousands and thousands of years, and as it spread through different cultures in the region, it became the various flood myths we know today, that of Gilgamesh and Noah and some of the others we discussed at the beginning of this video. So the fact that we have stories is really great, but since we're operating on a more scientific perspective, it doesn't really help us in terms of answering the question of did it happen or not. So we need some kind of proof. And it turns out that proof would be visible in 4 different forms. And the first of these forms of proof is looking at silt deposition. So as this ocean water rushed in to fill the Black Sea, it brought with it a lot of clay and dirt that was suspended in the water, which would gradually sink to the bottom and form layers that you could see if you dug deep enough into the Black Sea. And since it happened so rapidly, you'd expect to see a thick layer of silt, but that was uniform in its composition and widespread, since it's happened over a pretty large area that we can see, the part in green here. Another piece of evidence that scientists can look at is the fossilized remains of animals that were present at that time. Since the Black Sea was freshwater beforehand, you'd expect to see a shift from freshwater animals to saltwater animals because of the influx of saltwater into the Black Sea. The third type of evidence is carbon dating, so I'll just put carbon-14, and you'd expect to see a change in the carbon characteristics sometime around 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, and this flood is suspected to have taken place. And the last type of evidence that scientists can look at is kind of far-fetched, but it's human evidence. And as the theory goes, if humans lived in this green area and all of a sudden this water rushed in, if you went down in a submarine, let's say, you'd expect to see or find the remains of houses or at least some things that looked man-made. Well, it turns out that there is a large layer of silt that is consistent with a big flood, and you do see a shift in animals from saltwater to freshwater. And you see similar changes in carbon dating as well. And the human remains is more iffy. There hasn't been any conclusive evidence yet, but it hasn't been ruled out entirely. So what is known for sure is that there definitely was a shift of a freshwater environment to a saltwater environment. So we can check this off, because that's definitely true, that the Mediterranean spilled back into the Black Sea and expanded it and converted it from an inland freshwater sea to a connected saltwater sea connected to the rest of the ocean. But the question is, how fast did this occur? If it occurred in the course of a year or less, as described in the theory, this could be the potential basis for the flood myth, but if it occurred over thousands or tens of thousands of years, then this doesn't really make much sense to account for the flood myths. So will we ever know for sure if this is the basis of the flood myths as told in the stories of Noah and Gilgamesh? Well, we don't really have an answer now. But it is for sure that scientists are going to continue to study this and examine the evidence to see if they can figure it out once and for all.